Uh, Good evening. My name's Rory Collins. I'm the head of the Nuffield Department of Population Health here at the University of Oxford. Thank you very much for coming. Before I go into my introduction, I want to apologize for reading from my notes, but I watched this fabulous TED Talk by Carol Cadwallader, the journalist who broke the story about Cambridge Analytica and the way in which Brexit and the Trump elections were affected by the use of personal data without the permission of people. And I was struck by its extraordinary eloquence without any notes whatsoever. And I really felt I couldn't match that. But also, I was very keen not to end up, as she has, being sued for defamation. So I thought it was safer to read what I've written, having checked it with my internal legal advice. So I am delighted that there's so many people here tonight to listen to what I think will be a fascinating discussion about the impact of fake news, or as some prefer, disinformation, on so many different aspects of our lives. I'm also extremely grateful to Damien Collins, Sir Simon Stevens, for agreeing to discuss these issues, and also for Sarah Montague for agreeing to keep them focused on articulating how best to address the problem. You may be wondering why a department that does research into the causes, prevention, and treatment of disease around the world would be interested in the issue of fake news. Well, obviously, in addition to the political and social impact of fake news, it also has an enormous impact on health. For example, Simon Stevens, who's here, has warned that false claims about the side effects of the MMR vaccine has led to reduced vaccination rates, and that we're now seeing epidemics of measles with big increases in the number of cases around the world associated with death and disability, particularly in poorer countries. Likewise, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has warned that false claims about the side effects of the cholesterol-lowering statin drugs has led to reductions in their use, leading to fatal heart attacks and disabling strokes that could otherwise have been avoided. In thinking about the adverse impact of fake news on health and how it might be controlled, I was reminded of the way in which the cholera outbreak in Soho in the mid-19th century was controlled. This is probably one of the most famous kind of uses of statistical analysis to understand and to control a disease. Different water companies were providing water to different wells in the Soho area. And Dr. John Snow recognized that there were a cluster of cases of cholera among people who were getting their water from one particular well. He removed the pump handle from that well, and the epidemic was controlled. He believed that what he'd done is block the access to the cholera poison. He had no idea what this poison was. This was all before the idea of germs had been considered and they had been identified. But removing the pump handle worked. The cholera epidemic ended. Damien Collins and his colleagues on the House of Commons Digital, Cultural, Media and Sports Committee, which he chaired at the time, released their report on disinformation and fake news in February 2019 after exhaustive investigation. If you haven't read it, it is a cracker. But it's the result of some 23 oral evidence sessions, 170 written submissions, 4,350 questions at the hearings. They defined disinformation as the deliberate creation and sharing of false and/or manipulated information that is intended to deceive and mislead audiences, either for the purposes of causing harm or for political, personal, or financial gain. And I think part of the problem is that there are so many different causes of this disease of fake news: to encourage social dissent, to win referenda and elections, to make money, or merely to be noticed, to become famous for destroying things. However, the committee identifies social media platforms, in particular Facebook, which it actually referred to in the report as digital gangsters, as the way that the poison of disinformation is being spread, as in the water in Soho. And so, as with Jon Snow's simple act of removing the pump handle, the committee stated that there was a solution. An urgent need, I quote, to establish independent regulation overseen by an independent regulator with statutory powers to monitor relevant tech companies, with the power to launch legal proceedings against them and to impose large fines for non-compliance. As the Information Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham, said, based on the evidence that was provided at the hearings by Facebook, again I quote, unless there is a legal order compelling a change in their business model, where you are the commodity, that's my quote, and their practice, they are not going to do it. They are not going to change the model. But will this government, or indeed any government, have the will to take on the companies? I very much look forward to hearing this evening how the poison of fake news can be neutralized. So Sarah, Damien, Simon, over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 45 minutes to an hour, and I'm sorry, I'm going to hog things for a while, but I am going to come out for questions in about half an hour or a little bit more. So I'm going to hop through a whole series of things with our two speakers, and then we'll be able to come back to some of them as you want in a short while. But I want to start things off actually with both of you, in a way sort of setting out the stall, because we have what you call, Damien Collins, democracy at risk as a result of fake news. And of course, Sir Simon, you've talked about health, the health of society at risk. Damien, why, in what way is democracy at risk from what we know happens online?
Well, there's a lot more to being a democracy than holding elections. They have elections in Russia. They have elections in lots of countries around the world which we wouldn't recognize as being a free and open democracy. And that's because part of being a democracy is freedom of speech, but also the right to challenge what people say and examine and interrogate what people say. Over a period of time, we've established various practices around the way media in this country works. If you don't like something that's written about you in a newspaper, you can take the editor to court, you can take the newspaper to a complaints body. There's a regulator that oversees radio and broadcast television if you believe that you've been wronged in some way. There are checks and balances built within the public discourse. The other thing that's really important to democracy is that you know who's speaking and what they're saying. You know, if someone is making a claim, you know who they are. If it's a politician, you can see who's donated money to them, what organizations they might represent. You can weigh up lots of information about them in order to make your own informed decision as to whether you trust what they say. What's happened in the social media world, the internet world, is many of those things we relied on have been taken away from us. You can see adverts being run to support organizations or campaigns, and you have no idea who is running them, whether it's a campaign organization in your own country or indeed an agency of the Russian government, as was exposed particularly in the American election in 2016. You don't have the sort of information. You can't challenge the people that are doing it. You have no means of redress. But worse than that, what you see can be influenced and gamed by external people. If when you went onto Facebook or YouTube, what you saw was an organic list of the things your friends had last posted, just there in a timeline, a simple timeline, then that would be one thing. But what you're seeing is information that has been ranked and sifted to hold your attention, to reinforce ideas that you may have, or is being micro-targeted at you by people paying and promoting to do that. You may find yourself in groups sharing information that are being controlled by people and you don't know who they are. So this is the world within which people are accessing information. And it's come at a time when not only do these techniques allow this to happen, but whereby social media platforms are becoming the principal place where people go to get news and information. YouTube is the #1 broadcasting channel in this country for people under the age of 35. People watch more YouTube and Netflix, which is not a political channel, but just to give you an idea of the shift, And 18 to 35-year-olds watch double the amount of time of those two channels than they do the whole of terrestrial broadcasting put together. That's the shift that's taking place. So that's the landscape for it and why it is so important. And for me, the way you reconcile here the issue of freedom of speech is to say, I don't believe that freedom of speech is the same as freedom of reach. Someone may post something on their Facebook page or make a film for their friends on YouTube and share it. But does that give them the right to use the systems of social media to broadcast and target millions of people many times a day at the click of a button without having to reveal who they are or why they're doing it, and where there's no redress or challenge on their claims, and no way for the viewer to really know or understand whether what they're saying is true or not, or to challenge it or not. And that is the ecosystem in which we're operating. And what concerns me is not only does that exist, but there are no real obligations placed on the social media platforms to alert and warn people as to what's going on. If I put a leaflet through your door in the general election, there has to be a piece of type on that that says legally who paid for that leaflet and who it's there to promote. There's no legal requirement to do the same thing on social media. And we've seen how foreign states and other actors can game these systems to try and influence what people see and what people think. So that, for me, is why it is a challenge to democracy.
Well, can I ask you what the worst of what you were talking about was that you've seen and that you know happened? Because there will be a lot of people who say, look, I kind of get your point. It's much more important and bigger now than it was. But really, it sort of seems to be self-correcting. What is the worst that you saw that you thought that absolutely, if that was more widely known, people would not accept it?
Well, I think in the report, the most egregious thing is it was in Myanmar. It was the punishment, beatings, and killings against people in the Rohingya community were organised on Facebook. Facebook could have seen that was going on and didn't intervene to do that. But a really clean example, is the issue of Russian ad buying in the 2016 election, and it's a clean and very good comparison. The Russians paid for ads in rubles to target American voters from St. Petersburg. That's a federal offence. Facebook didn't spot it at the time. They didn't spot it for a year after. They only went to look for it when they were bullied into doing it by the American authorities, and they found evidence of it. And then they said, well, of course, if it's there, then we'll cooperate with investigations. If you were a bank and there was someone laundering money through your systems as a bank, and you didn't notify the authorities, you'd lose your license. You couldn't say, well, it looks suspicious, but no one complained, and therefore I didn't do anything about it. There are standards that exist standards of responsibility that exist in normal daily life for many businesses and organizations in this country, and the same legal requirements don't exist on social media, and because they don't exist, they don't do it. Our electoral law, which is created to protect our democracy, principally telling us who is donating money and who is campaigning, those same laws which we created over the last 100 years to protect us don't exist online in the same way, and they should do.
We're going to come back to not least Facebook that you've been talking about, but I want to move on to Sir Simon to talk about the impact on health, because actually there have been cranks forever. There's been misinformation forever. People will believe all sorts of nonsense. What is so different that requires some intervention as a result of what is happening online?
Well, you're right, Sarah. The sort of human history is littered with quackery, and that's a fascinating field of study in its own right. A chap called Henry Wellcome, who was a great pharmaceutical inventor, formed a collection, actually, of dodgy devices, and you can see them in the Science Museum. One of my favourites is the use of a tobacco smoke-filled bellows, which was inserted in the anus to revive people who had drowned. We saw in the 1920s, there was a fellow called William Bailey who came up with a radioactive jockstrap to energize and in fact cause cancer in the men who felt it would be useful to them. Enemas have obviously got a long history going back to the Pharaohs, and Gwyneth Paltrow on her Goop website as we speak is selling you a DIY coffee enema machine. So yes, look, there's a long history of quackery, but why does this matter? And we shouldn't panic about it, because actually trust in science remains strong. Doctors, health professionals are highly respected and thought to be likely to be telling the truth in this country. But I think it matters for two reasons why we need to be attentive. The first is that some of these claims for using the sorts of informational vectors that Damien has described are probably putting people off treatments that would work, or worse, are inducing them to take treatments that will be actively dangerous. So that's sort of one category of problem. And the second category of problem is where people avoid some form of public health measure, of which vaccination would be the case in point, and the negative consequences are not necessarily experienced by themselves, but by other people's children or immunocompromised individuals. And if you just take, as you said at the start, Sarah, MMR as an example, since the measles vaccine was developed 50 years ago in this country, we've prevented around 20 million cases and at least 4,500 deaths. And we have just lost our measles-free status as a result of a decline over the last several years. And some of that is things the NHS needs to get right, but some of that, frankly, are lies and myths that are being peddled online. And when you peel away the surface of who's doing the peddling, it is not quite as innocent as you might imagine.
In what way? Because when you talk about MMR, of course, the problem, or one of the first big moves against MMR, was prior to social media and the internet being so pervasive in our life. It was when Andrew Wakefield went on regular media and talked about it. And it is perhaps that is still being propagated, but it's just the internet spreading what people would be talking about anyway.
Well, it's interesting. You see, when you say it's just the internet, it turns out that there isn't a thing called just the internet. Actually, when you get under the skin of it, it turns out there was a study in the journal Vaccines last year, which showed that actually 54% of the anti-vaccination adverts that were showing up on social media were posted by only two groups, backed by two prominent wealthy individuals. And then when you look at some of the bots and trolls amplifying the vaccine debate, a really interesting study published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2018 showed that actually this was deliberately being promoted through a lot of the Russian troll factories as a way of sowing social discord. So look, without being paranoid about it, the fact is, drawing back the veil and understanding what it is we're being targeted with reveals that it is not just the legitimate concerns or questions that people have. These are being deliberately stoked by actors with an agenda that is not necessarily visible to the naked eye.
Okay, but I have, and I love this thing, you've released a press release this afternoon about what you're going to say tonight, and you really do go for Gwyneth Paltrow in it. And in a way, it's not just for her jade eggs and scented candles, but the psychic
usually scented candles. Yeah.
Yes. In what way are they?
I think Google it.
No, well, I was struck by the psychic vampire repellent for $27. And in a way, I thought, in a way, you're having a go at her very publicly. Is she doing harm with this? I mean, if I'm idiot enough to spend $27 on a psychic vampire repellent, don't I just lose the $27? I probably, it's not going to...
Well, there's clearly an exchange rate problem as well, because actually on the website in the UK, it's £26. And so here it is. There is a psychic vampire repellent protection mist. Now, at one level, who cares about that? That is
exactly.
not... That is just... Look, idiots and their money will soon be parted. That's not the issue. The issue is...
But you do this to get the papers interested.
No. The issue is stuff that is being promoted on that website as an alternative to established treatments, which therefore displaces treatments that work or potentially is harmful to the individuals who take them. And then the question is, what is the responsibility of the platforms as well as the vendors?
Well, also, what is the responsibility of, for example, in your case, the NHS, to put a message out there to say, look, because in a free world with free speech, rather than clamp down, because we're about to move on to obviously what the possible solutions to this are, you could just put out a more convincing message. What's the answer to that argument?
Well, we have put out a message that caffeine-related enemas do carry risks. That is on the NHS website. But that may not be the first place that people go when considering these possibilities. So, look, the reality is that as I said, quackery has kind of got a long history. It is when it produces wider impacts either on individuals or collectively that we need to pay attention. We shouldn't panic about this, we shouldn't overreact, but we should be attentive to it because there are really two engines of the sort of increased scale that social media brings about. One is the economic interests, and it's not just individual vendors, it's actually so-called attention capitalism out of the social media companies, and/or it is the sort of ideological convictions that are secretly being shared with us, whether it's through Russian bots and others.
And so if a company like Amazon is selling a book that is promoting the anti-vax movement, do you think they should be clobbered too?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because just as I was coming here, Sarah, I did actually go onto Amazon on my iPad here, and I just typed in the book section, vaccination. And right now in the UK, 9 out of 10 of the first books that come up on Amazon are anti-vaccination lies.
And that's not just because you've been Googling it before. They're not
No,
responding to your
anybody
algorithm.
can reach for your phones now and prove it to yourselves. No, the very first one is vaccination policy in the UK government, the Untold Truth, which is not quite a truthful title. Then we have the vaccines projects. We have vaccination is not immunisation. We have stuff they don't want you to know. We have vaccination thoughtful parents guide. We have herd immunity, misspelt. We have vaccines, the biggest medical fraud in history, as well as a variety of others that I won't bother reading out. But you get the picture. So actually, Amazon does have a responsibility here, which they are not currently exercising, which is one of the recommendations that Damien's committee came up with, which is that, for example, people shouldn't just be able to self-publish and Amazon just sort of neutrally display those. So, I mean, I don't know, Damien, if you want to kind of draw out your recommendation on that, but you were right.
A good live example that exists, and it only exists because it's been made a fuss of in the past, is if you went on to, say, Google and looked for music, music to buy, you'll be directed towards licensed content. Now, there is pirated content out there, but it's been made deliberately hard to find. They've changed their algorithms to do that. So there's no reason that Amazon couldn't do. If someone was looking for a book on vaccination, they find legitimate books of accepted medical theory about vaccination. There may still be some books on there about anti-vax, but maybe you've got to expressly search for that to find it, and it's not presented as being legitimate information or not. We need companies to start to think about their responsibilities to the way in which they promote content to people, because I think particularly when it is being run by an algorithm, and the algorithm's only concern is not the quality of the information you're seeing, but holding your attention. Therefore, it thinks you're interested in anti-vax books, it'll give you more of them. If it thinks you're interested in any particular form of content, it'll just serve you more of the same. And it creates a very distorted impression to people of what people generally think and what's generally accepted wisdom. And therefore, now I think there's express sanctions that should be taken, I think, if companies fail to act against harmful and illegal content. I think there also should be some responsibility over the way their algorithms work, and they're not constantly directing people towards the most harmful forms of content on their platforms.
Okay, now I'm going to tread here carefully, given what Rory Collins, the point he made at the beginning about reading his script for fear of legal repercussions. But you, I mean, we talk about, when we're focusing on why companies are doing this, and you are incredibly critical of Facebook. They're the one you reach for, even just reaching for the worst example. What do you think their intention is?
So Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg tried to define this in a, I think, quite interesting speech he gave at Georgetown University last autumn, and about the sort of parameters of freedom of speech. But Facebook have got itself in this odd position where if I set up a fake profile on Facebook telling the truth, that will be taken down. If I set up a real Facebook telling lies, then that's free speech. So they will act against what they call inauthentic accounts, because you have to be a real person, but they won't make a judgment on what people are saying, unless
Isn't that fair enough? Because the individual is answerable for what they're putting up there.
They are, if you can find them and you know who they are. But sometimes I think some of the accounts that they believe are real people could still be people that are very difficult to trace. I don't believe it's the job of the platforms to arbitrate in terms of opinion. But if someone is deliberately, maliciously spreading information that could be harmful, that is known and clearly demonstrable to be lies, is not opinion, is being presented as fact, but it's known to be a falsehood, then I think for someone to say, well, this is just free speech, and then not only are they saying these things, they're using the architecture of social media to create groups where they can push that content to millions of people all of the time. Then we should have a view on that. We should do something about that. If I set up a if I set up a community radio station in Oxford, broadcasting a student radio station, say broadcasting to 10,000 people, I've got to get a license from Ofcom to do it. If I set up a YouTube channel broadcasting to 10 million people, it's totally unregulated. And why is that? Why do we still distinguish between audiences in that way, simply because of the technology that they use, when for most people it's just all the same thing?
Okay, what's the answer?
The answer is to create an independent regulatory body that's got the power to hold these companies to account, that holds standards for them. So for harmful and illegal content, where it's either been identified and reported to the tech companies, or it's easily within their means to see it for themselves, they should be removing and downgrading that content and deleting accounts that are posting it.
Ofcom.
Ofcom, we should have an independent regulator. I believe Ofcom should do that as our current content broadcast regulator. They should impose the same sorts of standards based on a code given to them by Parliament with the legal powers to do that and the legal powers to audit. What I'd also like to see as well is when something goes wrong, say like there's the incident of the Christchurch terrorist attack, where that footage was shared through social media, not just Facebook, but YouTube and other platforms as well. I think the company should have, a regulator should have the right to go in and audit it and say, okay, well, why did it take 17 minutes for the live feed to be shut down? And what were the principal accounts that were sharing that content? And what action have you taken against them? We don't know. We've got no right to know.
But here's the thing that I can't quite get my head around. There's Ofcom, a British regulator that actually isn't designed to be doing this anyway, but you're saying should be policing the global internet.
It should be policing what people can see in this country. In France, there's a new rule on disinformation in elections, which means a judge can identify something as being fake news and order it to be taken down. In Germany, they have turned their offline legislation on hate speech and pro-Nazi speech online as well. So if you post content on social media and it's not taken down, there are massive fines for the companies. The consequence of that national legislation, just within one EU member state, is that Facebook massively increased the number of fact checkers and people checking content they employed. They have the resources to do this, and they have the capability to do it country by country if they have to, and they can. So I think we should do what we think is right to protect the interests of our citizens, to create a legal duty of care for these massive companies towards the people that use their services, and we should enforce it. We shouldn't, otherwise we are leaving the regulation of media in this country to Mark Zuckerberg with no control, no sanction, no oversight. And people like him.
Just to be clear, you're talking about a whole raft of new laws and a whole vast new department within Ofcom that individuals could report to.
So, but this exists in other industries. So in banking, as I said earlier on, if a bank is responsible for identifying money laundering and fraud and for making sure the products it sells are fair. If it fails, then it knows there's a big price to pay. It could lose its license. There's not someone checking everything they do. They don't ask permission for everything to be signed off. There are responsibilities set out for them, and they have to meet them. If you launch a new financial product, the Financial Conduct Authority won't sign it off for you.
Okay,
they'll say it looks okay, but it's down to you. You're responsible. And what we have to do, create the legal framework. We say to the tech companies, you're responsible. We expect you to police it. But if things go wrong and we find out that things have gone wrong, then there are real sanctions that will be applied.
So I set up a Facebook group, and I've got lots and lots of friends, and I tell them all they should not be vaccinating their children.
Yeah.
And what happens then? Is that allowed, or should I, under what Simon's talking about, I shouldn't be allowed to get away with that, should I?
So
well, it's in a way, it's a question for both of you. I'm trying to see how you seriously police it.
I think there are, one of the ways you do it is around audiences as well. So I don't think you can create a regulatory model where everyone says to their family and friends is regulated and policed, because that will be an impossible task. But what you say, when someone is setting themselves up to be an expert and is broadcasting that externally to a large audience that they've controlled, that is not their close family and friends, but an audience of over a certain size and scale, you apply certain standards to them and the content they show. And you maybe make it harder to find, so it can't be broadcast to wide audiences. It's not picked up in the general algorithm. Someone generally searching for it wouldn't find it. It may exist in a very discreet way for a small number of people. But what you can't let someone do...
Let's say I did some simple thing like that, and my post that's saying vaccinations are absurd, and my child got autism and your child will too, and somebody retweets, reposts, it gathers speed on the internet. My intention wasn't to reach that many people. That's surely the content of that message is exactly what you are talking about.
Yeah, so in a case like that, where I think the company should step in and they should downgrade content on that or remove it if it's clearly spreading something which is harmful. It may be in that case beyond the control of the person who posted it, has become suddenly a mass viral message. The platforms can see that virality taking place. They can see the speed and the scale with which it's spreading, and I think they have a responsibility to intervene and not allow the short-term popularity of that message to infect the general algorithms of the whole system, and therefore infect what other people see who are casually looking for information on that subject. I think when things reach that sort of scale, the platforms have a responsibility to step in. Otherwise, what people see, the ranking attached to it, the priority is not based on the value of the content, but simply the algorithmic swarm around it. How many people are sharing it?
Now, I can imagine a situation, Sir Simon, where if that happened, there will be groups of mums thinking, this is just typical. They don't want me to hear the truth. Those elites sitting, well, wherever they are in London with their thinking they know better and wanting to control my life.
No, of course.
And taking my Facebook group away from me.
No, which is not what I don't think I'm certainly not suggesting that. I don't even think that's what Damon was suggesting. But the fact is that if the majority of these posts are originating invisibly from sources that are not obvious to me, then I would like to know that as a parent. And so having that reveal so I can judge the source of these claims, I think is part of the legitimate debate that then occurs in the public sphere. Secondly, I think we've got to think about the same kind of judgments as were applied, in fact, that the BBC applies to false equivalence on other scientific debates. I think on the question of climate change, it is now not accepted in the BBC and other broadcasters that you simply have both sides of the argument for equivalence, when actually the balance of scientific opinion is very, very clearly in one direction. So that in turn feeds into the algorithm weighting questions that Damien was talked about. And remember, these things don't occur by accident. These are hardwired into the business model of the platforms. And so clickbaitery is part of the problem here.
And I think that's a really important point. And something that, if you're a company like Facebook or YouTube, you could spot, is things don't go viral by accident. Now, if it's in your story, it's someone's innocent comment or their own personal views, it's been picked up and it suddenly goes viral, that will be because someone has got behind it. This is a technique the Russians use, is they will take innocent people's stuff that suits their interests and they will promote it. What the platforms can spot is coordinated activity by large networks of groups and accounts promoting a certain sort of content. So that could be anti-vaccine. And what these networks will be doing is they're not promoting your message, they're promoting lots and lots of messages that are doing the same thing. And in a case like that, the important thing we'd want the platforms to do is intervene not so much against the individual, but against these coordinated networks of accounts and groups that are spreading this sort of content. I mean, someone was telling me, I was talking to a company the other day who work a lot on Facebook, and they will say that Facebook will promote through advertising content for you. There's a whole sort of dark market of people who will do it sort of for cheaper, using huge pages, networks, groups that they have, and they can just push content through the platform at a fraction of the cost and reach millions of people, with the sort of information you want them to see. And therefore, that sort of activity on that sort of scale is stuff that only the people that run the platforms can see. And I think we should say to them, there are some responsibilities that we think you should adhere to, and if you don't, then there should be some sanctions.
Can you see this government making this change?
I think I'm encouraged by the work that was done before the election on the government's online harms white paper, which talks about the idea of an independent regulator, legal duty of care, liabilities, legal sanctions, massive fines for companies that fail to meet that the big tech platforms wouldn't be neutral platforms, that have some limited responsibility in law for that content. And I think we're expecting in the next few weeks to see the government's response to that white paper, and I hope legislation. Now, as always, when you talk about the way policy and ideas become law, it sounds like a cumbersome parliamentary sort of and civil service-led process, but not there's anything wrong with civil servants, but just can take time. But we could establish in this country, and there's the will to do it, a world-leading regime for content regulation and placing responsibilities on tech companies for the content that they serve that is more akin to the sort of responsibility and regulation that exists in other industries. I think what's happened with tech is it's grown so fast that the sort of oversight that exists in other industries hasn't kept pace, and now it's time to introduce it. So I'm confident that will happen. I'm
going to come out for questions in just a minute. But I just want to ask you about, you talk about Facebook. Nick Clegg speaks for Facebook now, and he was on the radio the other day talking about, look, it's not in their interest to allow some of the worst of these behaviours. It's not like the company is trying to encourage, particularly with regard to online harm. What's your answer to that?
No, I heard that interview, but the question is, what are they doing to stop it? They don't, of course, they don't want to encourage it. But what are they doing proactively to stop it, to identify the key accounts where they do this? And I think that the heart of this as well is they gather the data every day to do this, to sell ads. These are Facebook and Instagram are advertising businesses. They gather all your data so they can sell it to advertisers to target you with stuff. And that's not just how many times you visited the Marks & Spencer's homepage. That is aggregating huge quantities of data. And I think if you want to look at harm on that, we've seen lots of stories of young people that have self-harmed, that have engaged with harmful content on social media, and they say, why don't they take that down? But the companies know who these accounts are. They could map the content they're seeing. And if I was a charity, if I was, say, a children's charity or Samaritans, and I went to Instagram and said, I've got the profiles here of 100 teenage girls that have self-harmed, having engaged with content showing self-harm on Instagram, and I want to find an audience of 100,000 people that are the closest possible data match to these 100 sets of data I've got, these 100 accounts I've got. And I'm an advertiser. I want to advertise to these people with messages to reach out to say, I want to help you. There's a tool called Lookalike Audiences that exists on Facebook and Instagram that will do that. Will find you.
And they wouldn't be stopped by any privacy.
No, anyone in this hall could go to.
Have charities done that?
Well, I've spoken to some charities about this, the system that they do to demonstrate what the capability of this data is. And why don't we use this data to do good rather than just to make money?
Because those charities could effectively preempt things going wrong.
And Facebook and Instagram could work with them to say, this is an issue. Our job is not just to take down all the harmful content, it's to reach out to people we think are in danger of harming themselves because that content is there. And we've got the data to do it. We use the data to run ads. Why can't we do it to save people's lives?
Okay, let's get some microphones out. There are, I think, some people with microphones, and I am going to keep an eye out, and we're going to try and bounce around as quickly as possible. I think we've got roving mics on that tier too. But if I keep an eye out for some questions, there's one here, and then the lady through a few rows back. Sorry, starting at the front because I can see them first. So if you get... no, we won't. We'll start at the back because the microphone appears to be there. Do you want to pass that, and then you can bring it forward? And can the other microphone come over here? Thank you very much. And if you keep an eye on me, I'll direct you. Go ahead with your question, please.
So last week it was revealed that actually, quite fittingly, a fellow of Nuffield College had done work for Cambridge Analytica and SDL elections. What does the panel think that academic institutions should really be doing to make sure that their own ethical guidelines and their own governance and management of research they're conducting is in line with the proposals that you're suggesting?
Okay, so...
well, I mean, obviously as an Oxford graduate, it's nice to have a dig at Cambridge. Obviously, the Cambridge Psychometric Centre is being investigated by the Information Commissioner's Office because of the work that Cambridge Analytica Cambridge Analytica hired data scientists from Cambridge University to work on their projects and the data hack that was exposed at Facebook. Now, I think every university should take that as a bit of a wake-up call, because this was being done supposedly by researchers doing supervised projects with funding at the universities, and I don't think there was very much scrutiny as to exactly what they were doing, and probably there should have been more. So I think the university should see this as now being in scope, and so there should be more understanding of whether what people are doing in these projects meets the data protection laws that we have to abide by.
So that's Damien's dissing of Cambridge. I'll do a plug for Oxford, which is that obviously we have something called the Oxford Internet Institute, and they have the gloriously titled Centre for the Study of Computational Propaganda, which is actually looking under the skin of some of the issues we've been talking about and actually helping people understand the kinds of information manipulation that we've been describing. So I think, frankly, universities have got a really important role here. If you think about the sort of health-related elements of this, I mean, there is a new kind of the epidemiology of the internet almost that we need to begin to understand and study in just the same way as we would with viral transmission in the physical world.
I mean, like a lot of things, I mean, there's a good reason why I think big tech companies have liked working with universities on anonymized data to understand the capabilities of what can be done with it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that in principle, but clearly sometimes people cross the line of what's legal and acceptable.
Is there not some ethical oversight? Am I being rather green here and naive? Perhaps somebody from the university might want to answer that. They're very welcome to do so if there's not some ethical oversight of what you're actually doing with the big tech guys. I'll leave that thought hanging there. Question in the front.
Hello. Can I ask about trusted sources? So to counter fake news, where do people go? And actually,
hello.
Have we? Yes, and all power to the BBC, says I as the BBC journalist. But have we learnt a lesson, though, that actually one of the problems is that we think that we treat people as being information deficits at state, that if we just pile more information into them, they will surely agree with us. And actually, for heaven's sake, we should have realised by now that actually they don't. And a lot of what this is about is belief systems. And so if we have to develop trusted sites, we need to really work with social scientists, behavioral psychologists, to work out how to put news in such a way, or information in such a way, that people are not irritated by it and go against it, but are likely to understand it and accept it.
Let me support what you've said and then disagree with it. To support what you said, yes, I think you can argue that a lot of our debate on truth in social media, these anxieties about facts are actually anxieties about deeper political disagreements. And there's quite good evidence that simply changing people's understanding of facts will not necessarily change their preferences about which we disagree in a healthy democracy. So it's a sort of rationalist fallacy to think that if we could just all agree to facts, then everything would immediately fall into some huge national consensus on every disputed topic. So that's clearly right. On the other hand, there is some empirical evidence that actually it is possible to change people's minds by reference to showing them facts. There's a group, two guys, Ethan Porter and Thomas Wood, who published a book last year called False Alarm, looking at 13 studies where actually showing people facts across the ideological divide produced a 30 percentage point increase in people's willingness to actually switch their beliefs. So, the Keynes principle, when the facts change, I change my mind, what do you do, turns out to be true. And they also showed that this notion that you get a backfire effect, that the more you try and ram home the truth, it just digs people into believing that 9/11 never happened and Elvis is alive on the moon, that backfire effect itself is not true. So that's the good news. But what they also showed was that even when you peeled away those layers of facts, it didn't fundamentally affect the underlying value judgments or social preferences that people were revealing.
But isn't there also something at schools that should be done, which is, right from the word go, which arguably in some schools is being done, about that question, having a question mark over what you're reading online?
But the question is, do we give people the tools to do it? Are those tools there? So if you look at a news website that you've seen access to story through social media, does it tell you very much information about that site? Does it tell you do we know where it is? Who writes for it? Can you complain about it? Has it been linked to other disinformation campaigns in the past? The sort of tools that a consumer might use to weigh up whether they trust one news source or another don't exist. The other thing I'll say as well is the idea of social media was, Mark Zuckerberg talks about this, is that it creates plurality. You've got millions of voices, billions of voices around the world, part of the same conversation, and therefore that's good for democracy. Instead of one massive democratic conversation, I think what we've seen is millions of autocracies, where what people largely see is pockets of the same stuff, as if you were in a dictatorship, just being reinforced with the same information.
The lady here, and then I'll go up there and we'll try and get a microphone up to the gentleman up there.
How would you propose dealing with the issue of elected politicians spreading disinformation, which obviously in the case of Italy, they've done with vaccines, and they have many followers? And I guess just as a coda to what we've just been talking about, it's worth saying that one of the other really important things that when there are trusted news sources like the BBC, there's due discoverability and attribution, so people at least know what they're looking at.
Well, one answer is, frankly, building on the trust that the public have for health professionals relative to politicians. So there's the messenger as well as the message. And I know this won't come as news, but it might be disappointment to Damien. When Ipsos Mori do this annual survey, this veracity index, who do we believe? And I have to say, politicians come out at 19%, and doctors come out at 92%. And nurses come out at 96%. So the simple answer is put nurses to correct politicians and the public will, generally speaking, go along with
it. The lady up there.
Who decides what's fake? I think if I remember rightly, the MMR scandal began with a peer-reviewed, highly, journal paper, which has subsequently been withdrawn by that journal. If you think of something like the debate now about how much alcohol is bad for you, we used to see tobacco, people saying tobacco was good for you and doctors saying, smoke and it'll clear your lungs. How do we decide in a debate like something about how much you should drink or should you drink at all, where there are clear big commercial interests that have a particular vested interest, what is fake?
Who are we to diss the vampire face mask?
Well, I mean, I sort of tend to go along with a guy called Richard Rorty, who's a philosopher who says, look, fundamentally, better versions of the truth will be those that are more useful to human beings over the medium to long term. So part of the problem with the sort of fakery around vaccines is vaccines are victims of their own success. People don't get to see the feedback loops and the consequences. But in a number of the examples you've just rightly cited, frankly, that is, the science is unclear, the debate is out there, and that's perfectly legitimate that it should be so. As it happens, I think in the case of the Lancet Andrew Wakefield original publication, they withdrew that partly as a result of a research fraud question that led to Andrew Wakefield being struck off the medical register. So look, I mean, where there's a case of fraud, that's different than just a case of scientific uncertainty.
If I can sort of add on to that and also respond to the previous question as well on sort of political facts, if you like, which are often disputed. I mean, obviously you could have two politicians here arguing about the state of the economy or funding for the health service and present different facts that would present totally different interpretations. And obviously we just had a general election where you saw that happen every day. But what I don't think you can do is arbitrate then on where people are using facts and information as part of argument and persuasion. Then people have to make their own minds up about who they believe ultimately, and people do. But I think where there are clearly egregious things where people, I think, and for me, the really live version of this, I think it's about to become a much bigger problem, is when you look at things like deep fake films. And the film of Nancy Pelosi in America last year is, I think, a good early example of this, where someone creates a distorted fake film of Nancy Pelosi to make her look like she is incapable of doing her job at a press conference, and they share that, and that's shared as if it's fact, and it's totally fabricated. That's the sort of thing we should be able to make calls on those sorts of things and say, actually, if it's been done maliciously, that release during an election campaign could be done to try and sway people, how people vote, pervert democracy, and we should call these things out and we should stop them.
I'm just going to hit pause on your question because I just want to just explore this question of deep fakes, because does it not mean if you can alter a video to make somebody say whatever you want them to say, aren't we entering a world where you cannot trust anything? Because obviously at the moment we presume, I saw him say it or heard him say it.
Yes, and so that's the consequence of that. And so therefore we have to think now, what are the interventions that we want to try and stop that happening?
Do they exist?
Well, so Mark Zuckerberg has said that Facebook will, having said they wouldn't take down any deepfake films, and they won't. They've said if it is AI generated, so if it's like a sort of a digital puppet of someone who looks like them, saying words and putting into their mouth, they might take that down. I believe the technology gets to identify fake content that is a mashup of somebody's, from lots of digital samples of their voice and pictures of them to make it look like them speaking. I think the technical capability is there to do it. I think what we should require of the tech companies is that they do it. They regard it as their responsibility, because they may be the only people that have got the power to identify these films.
And that won't remove all the funniest stuff we've all seen over the last few years is where they're effectively doing that.
Well, no. So I think there's a difference between satire and fun stuff of literally crudely putting, redubbing someone's voice, to actually creating a perfect digital replica of somebody and using that to put words in their mouth they've never said. Now, this technology is being used. I've seen the BBC developing this technology for news reading in foreign languages and minority languages all around the world to support World Service Television, where you can have a BBC presenter speaking in 1,000 different languages, on a script that's been put into their mouth, and it'll look like them saying it. But I've also seen that technology used to see Barack Obama read a speech by George Bush. So we have to be wary that this exists and understand that there will be times where we want to flag to people that this is made up. This is not. It may look real, but it's actually totally fabricated. And we should be able to go to the tech companies and say, where this has been done maliciously, particularly during an election campaign, then you should be restricting its distribution because it could influence the outcome of an election.
Let's go to the gentleman up there.
You asked specifically, Sarah, whether academics don't have an interest in the ethics of this matter. Well, no, they don't, actually. The academic publishing imperative is to get as many papers in top journals as you possibly can. The truth is really secondary. In fact, you could almost go further and say that it's much harder to get cutting-edge research published. It's much harder to say anything of any importance than simply to say what everyone else has said, what is likely to be most cited, what's going to contribute most to impact factor. Don't look to academics to save you from fake news.
Can I just I want to ask a question of the room, a show of hands. And I'll be guided by you whether the better question is to ask whether social media, these big companies, should have legal liability, or whether, perhaps it's whether they should be overseen by a regulator. Can everybody, let me do it this way round. If you don't think they should be overseen by a regulator, could you put up your hand? Now, it feels a bit unfair to pick on those, but if anybody did want to articulate why, we'd love to hear from you, because obviously there's quite a lot. I don't know if you're asking a question or going to explain why, but if there's a microphone near one of those gentlemen there, that would be great to hear. And then I'll get back on track with questions. Because we are obviously hearing a lot from one side of the argument. Thank you.
I think my concerns are sort of twofold. So one, if the problem really is we don't trust platforms, they're just not trustworthy, then it's unclear to me why we should trust them with a sort of moderation responsibility, and why they wouldn't moderate just in, sort of a risk-averse way that would really deteriorate the quality of discourse online. Things that are clearly bad they would take down, but maybe things that we're not so sure they should take down, they might take down as well, just to avoid legal liability, especially if they're doing it via some sort of machine learning algorithm that's just adding to categories. I'm also concerned about the sort of human cost of moderation responsibilities, in the sense of, is Facebook just going to do this by outsourcing it to a team of really underpaid moderators in the Philippines that have to sort through really, graphic and horrible content? And is that sort of something that, as a government or as a society, we really want? Is that worse than a status quo where, maybe user education is a way around this, in the sense of, if you teach people to better distinguish between content which is likely to be fake or unreliable, then that might be a solution that avoids those issues?
Can I get you to just engage on, I think it's particularly the first point, this idea that really you're in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
I think all the points you made are really important to this debate. And I don't think we're saying by creating sort of a system of regulation and codes that we'd want a company like Facebook or YouTube to adhere to, that we're then passing the buck to them and saying, you enforce this. Actually, what we're trying to say is we want an external body that's going to set codes and principles for you. We want you to take responsibility for how you enforce them. But we want this regulator to have the power to come and inspect you and audit you and see that you're doing a good job. We don't necessarily expect you to get 100% compliance, but we want to see that you're trying and you're doing everything you can. And that if we're not convinced you are trying and we're not convinced you're doing what you can, then some action could be taken against you. And at the moment, that requirement isn't there. I think some of these things, technology has solved some of these problems for us. There was a debate, I remember a couple of years ago, the Home Office had with YouTube about identifying films that have been uploaded to recruit people to join terror organizations in the Middle East. They said they couldn't do it accurately. A London company did, demonstrated it could be done with 99.95% accuracy, and that technology was then used. Why is it, for example, that YouTube will not allow re-uploading of a film that's been taken down, but Facebook do? That's a technical difficulty, a technical challenge that one company's addressed, the other one hasn't, but a regulator could try and work with that company to see common standards. So I think I sort of think, unless you've got the regulator in the room and a code of principles we want the companies to work to, ultimately we are just devolving it to them, and they're marking their own homework. And for me, I think it's sort of, the issues are too serious to allow it to be done just in that way. But I think the job of the regulator, just as Ofcom does with broadcasters, is to work with companies to help them comply, not just punish them when they don't.
Okay, we've only got a few more minutes. There was another question. The gentleman there. Did I point to somebody else? Probably. If you could get the one here. Thank you.
I want to go back to the question of
We currently have a government which is boycotting large numbers of national radio and television programmes because it disagrees with political position. And we have an opposition party which is complaining about the political editor of BBC. Are government governments in democratic countries helping to exacerbate the problem by degrading the few existing trusted international sources of news that we have.
I hope everybody heard that. It may be because you're holding the end. Are governments degrading the trusted sources of news that we do have by their behaviour? Damien Collins.
Well, it's quite. I mean, in America, it's quite interesting because Donald Trump's attack on the New York Times as being fake news has been both good for Donald Trump and for the New York Times, which is enjoying sort of boom in its sales. So, but I think.
And the Conservative government's boycott of the Today programme?
Well, to be honest with you, that will stop when the Conservative Party thinks there's jeopardy in it. You know, if it thinks actually that people want to hear ministers being held to account on popular radio shows, popular TV shows, they expect it, and it will happen. These spats have happened from time to time between governments of all colours and the BBC and other broadcasters, and will continue. But I think there is a big difference here between, and I think the term fake news has become slightly tainted. When we started our committee inquiry, we called it fake news. We changed it to disinformation, to try, partly because Trump had used the term so liberally that, as you quite rightly say, it applied to anything he didn't like. I think what we're saying is it's not about things you don't like, it's about things that can be proven to be lies, that are being maliciously spread, and treating that as a separate, discrete category that we could do something about. But people will always have disagreements about what they like and what they don't like.
Let's have, I'm sorry, just one last question. The lady with the microphone there.
Well, it was just to tease out this difference between misinformation and fake news, because I've been heavily involved in the statins debate, and that didn't actually come from fake news, but from doctors. Misinformation coming from doctors and people in the medical profession who are against over-medicalisation. So nothing that Damien has said tonight would do anything about the terrible impact that that's had. And also to Simon, isn't it important to be really clear about whether the internet is the source of this harmful misinformation? Because on MMR and the problems we're having with the slight decline at the moment, I'm seeing very compelling figures of 80%, 90% of the public go to official sources. They go to NHS England, they go to Public Health England. So we might do this very drastic thing and ban all these websites or get Amazon to take down all these books and see absolutely no uptake in vaccines, because what we really need to do is just address these parents' concerns.
Simon, do you want to...
Yeah, well, to some extent, yes, I see what you're getting at, and in fact, I would say a little more broadly than that as well. There are things that the NHS can do to make vaccine easier for patients. So both catch-up programs for those who missed out on the MMR first time round. We've had a reduction in the number of school nurses. We've got opportunities, frankly, to make vaccination easier for people who are not opposed, but are maybe hesitant, or perhaps there's other things going on in their lives such that it's difficult to do. But the problem with, as you know, the term herd immunity, which is probably not a very good way of describing the collective benefits we all get from being vaccinated, is you don't need to fall very much below 95% for that to begin to have big spillover effects. So particularly for young children who are not yet eligible for the vaccine, or for example, a child who's going through a cancer treatment and therefore is immunocompromised, they are the innocent third parties, if you like, who will be affected by being at the sort of 87, 88, 89% rather than 95%. So every percentage point matters, I suppose.
Okay, can I ask, are you pushing on the government to, and I suppose, I mean, you could say, well, you are deeply involved, but are you pushing for more tougher action on the whole vaccination thing?
Yes, both in terms of the truth content of some of the claims that are being made online, and in terms of the NHS, what we need to do in terms of our own availability of vaccine
What's the
services.
next step? I'm sorry, perhaps
Well, we've talked specifically. We support the action that the government has taken is taking with the likes of Facebook and others around calling them out on the promulgation of these untrue claims by malicious actors. And I mean, even taking the sort of forensic definition of fake news that Damien gave, this clearly falls into that category. And that's quite different than just being uncertain as a parent, hearing about side effects and so forth. Getting to the root of the problem, that's where we should be tackling, while then supporting parents who have questions.
Which in a way speaks to the statins point that you were making, which is what you're suggesting wouldn't address anyway.
Well, I think also, I mean, when facts and information change, if there was information that's put out there that appeared to be from reputable sources and was allowed to and shared freely, but then that is challenged and demonstrated to be untrue, then I think the conversation then is about the relative weighting and ranking of that information and whether people have access to reliable, trustworthy information. It'd be a bit like, if we had the internet when we discovered the world was round, but flat earthism prevailed because the algorithm promoted that more aggressively and suggested to people actually that the science that had proven that the earth was round is actually all false, and the falsehood is true, then I think that's something we can do something about, and we can ask the technology companies to work with us to do something about that.
When do you think there will be a regulator?
I think if I think we should look to say that we could see a government bill legislated later this year, to be passed by Parliament next year, and the regulators already exist. It does some of that work for broadcasting anyway. But I think we're probably looking at the way systems work and government works in the next 1 to 2 years. I think we could see these principles established in law and a regulator working.
And you think it'll make that much difference to fake news?
I think there are grades of content here. The most harmful of which will be the most harmful illegal content. I think some of the things we've been talking about medical misinformation, which can endanger lives. I think we need to, alongside that, update our electoral law, which is a separate process, to make sure we have transparency in political communications and advertising on social media and online. We should do that anyway. And I think that starts to address the debate. I also believe when you start talking about deep fake films and clear, fake, malicious information being circulated around elections, then we should see that as a harmful form of content that we expect the tech company to do something about as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, Damien Collins to Simon Stevens.
Well, again, I'd like to thank you for all coming. I'd particularly like to thank Simon, Damien, and Sarah. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Damien Collins for the political courage that it must have taken to chair and create this report on disinformation. It is an extraordinary report. I really would encourage you to read it. And also, I can't pronounce an asterisk, so I won't say the name of this book, by Chris Wiley, who did a lot of the analysis for Cambridge Analytica, inside Cambridge Analytica's plot to break the world. But if you're disquieted by what you've heard, then read this and be really very afraid about what can be done and how we are being targeted. And one of the things that comes out, again, going back to my infection comments, is one of the comments made is that Brexit was the petri dish for the Trump election. And we should be thinking globally. Yes, the Wakefield paper on MMR was published in a British journal, The Lancet. But its impact is probably far greater outside the UK, in developing countries where the effect on MMR vaccination has been really substantial, and the effect on mortality and morbidity potentially catastrophic. And I think that what Damien is suggesting is that we can also do good internationally, because if you look at the impact of the GDPR, of the data protection law from the EU, it is taken very seriously in the US. So I think regulation here would allow the UK to take a leadership role. And I'd like to thank, on the NHS, Simon taking that leadership role, Damien, and Sarah for having got them to say things that might not have otherwise said so clearly. Thank you very much for coming along.